if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samuel. It is now 9:08 p.m. in an extremely cold, extremely dark, and extremely intimidating city of Budapest, where anyone who was planning on a nice early spring will and has been extremely disappointed. Very, very cold. And really, not too much sunshine either. But on a more cheerful note, thank you very much, everybody who has joined me, and really appreciate it. And of course, there's a lot of news today, and I think obviously we've had the much anticipated telephone conversation between President Trump and Putin, and then we also have the battle that is now broken out between the Trump administration and the judiciary, as led by Chief Justice John Roberts. Now, the phone call between Trump and Putin really didn't yield very much. I mean, anyone who had come in with some expectations that they would make some progress toward that 30-day ceasefire, and after that, the process of long-term negotiations, well, that didn't happen. It wasn't wholly a waste. The conversation lasted 2 hours. It's not clear how many, but 2 hours. Some reports say about 3 hours, but obviously it was a lengthy conversation. And the most substantial issue to emerge from it is the agreement on, at least on Trump's part, an agreement on not on Trump's part, I'm sorry, on Putin's part, an agreement on attacks, on the cessation of attacks on energy infrastructure. We'll see whether Ukraine agrees to that. So, but Putin does seem to have accepted that, and he's ready to implement that the cessation of the attacks on energy infrastructure. And I don't really see that as too much of a concession, because I haven't really seen any particular effect of that. It doesn't seem like these attacks on energy infrastructure have made the slightest impact. And I'm sure the Russians would be very happy for Ukraine to stop attacks on its energy infrastructure, or particularly on its oil refineries, chemical plants, and so on. Anyway, let's take a look first at the readouts, the specific readouts from the two sides. So here, first of all, is the Kremlin readout, which was much longer than the American readout. So here's the telephone conversation with U.S. President Donald Trump. And then it says the leaders continued a detailed and frank exchange of views on the situation around Ukraine. Vladimir Putin expressed gratitude to Donald Trump for his desire to help achieve the noble goal of ending hostilities and human losses. Having confirmed his fundamental commitment to a peaceful resolution of the conflict, the Russian president declared his readiness to work together with his American partners to thoroughly explore possible ways of resolving the conflict, which should be comprehensive, sustainable, and long-term, and of course to take into account the absolute need to eliminate the root causes of the crisis and Russia's legitimate interests in the area of security. So here, Putin and is reiterating what he said last week when he spoke about the offer of the 30-day ceasefire. So he said, "Yeah, we're interested in it. However, We've got to address various specific issues. It has to be a long-term settlement. It can't just be a short-term breather while Ukraine, and of course Ukraine supporters, simply continue to gather strength. So they made that clear. Got to be a long-term settlement, and we have to address the root causes. The root causes, of course, is first of all NATO expansion, and here in the Ukrainian regime. Um, Anyway, so it went on, so that here we are. It goes on. Then here we have Russia's legitimate interest in the area of security. And then he goes on, in the context of the US president's initiative to introduce a 30-day ceasefire, the Russian side outlined a number of significant points concerning ensuring effective control over a possible ceasefire along the entire line of combat contact. So that was something that Putin reiterated last week, which is who's going to monitor the ceasefire over that extremely long line of contact. The need to stop forced mobilization in Ukraine, which again wasn't mentioned in the original offer of the ceasefire, which is to stop forced mobilization, and above all, the rearming of Ukrainian armed forces, because of course, as you remember, when on that day of the negotiations in Saudi Arabia between Mike Waltz, Marco Rubio, and the Ukrainians, they said, well, they accompanied the announcement of Ukraine's acceptance of the 30-day ceasefire. Accompanying that was, well, now we, the Americans, are lifting our arms cessation. So in other words, the arms will once again flow into Ukraine. Intelligence sharing will resume. And of course, then the Europeans jumped in and said, yeah, fantastic. We're going to now start sending in our forces, as if the ceasefire was already a done deal, and that the Europeans, are going to be introducing their own forces into Ukraine, supposedly as peacekeepers, but in reality as trainers and and auxiliary forces of the Ukrainians. Anyway, so here we have rearmed the Ukrainian forces. So that obviously it's a non-starter. Putin said we can't have a 30-day ceasefire if the mobilization in Ukraine continues, if training of Ukrainian forces continues, and arms continue to flow into Ukraine. Serious risks associated with the inability to negotiate of the Kiev regime, which has repeatedly sabotaged and violated the agreements reached, were also noted. So you notice how the passive voice. We also notice, obviously, the Russians are the ones who brought this up. The serious risks associated with the inability to negotiate with the Kiev regime. In fact, Kiev has refused to negotiate, which has repeatedly sabotaged and violated the agreements reached, were also noted. Attention was drawn to the barbaric terrorist crimes committed by the Ukrainian militants against the civilian population of the Kursk region. And then he goes on. It was emphasized that the key condition for preventing the escalation of the conflict and working towards its resolution through political and diplomatic means should be the complete cessation of foreign military aid and the provision of intelligence information to Kiev. So here, they're not even talking about, Putin's saying that, look, if you want, to stop the escalation of the conflict, and if you want to work towards the resolution through political and diplomatic means, you have to stop sending foreign military aid and intelligence to Kiev. So that's in the long term. That's not even the 30-day ceasefire, but that's just simply, we insist on this, that you stop arming Ukraine. And then, in connection with Donald Trump's recent appeal to spare the lives of Ukrainian servicemen surrounded in the Kursk region, Vladimir Putin confirmed that the Russian side is ready to be guided by humanitarian considerations and, in the event of their surrender, guarantees the lives and decent treatment of Ukrainian armed forces soldiers in accordance with Russian laws and international law. So, if you recall, last week, last Friday, in fact, Trump got suddenly very agitated about the Ukrainian armed forces in Kursk and that they were on the brink of being massacred. And here, and then and Putin responded to Trump's truth by saying, "Yeah, well, I appreciate your humanitarian concern. I understand it, but there's a way to deal with this issue. If the Ukrainians surrender, give up their arms and surrender, they will be entitled to all humanitarian considerations. If they don't surrender, then they could be massacred, whatever." And that was obviously the point. I mean, Trump's intervention there was kind of foolish. You can't just simply say, "Well, these soldiers are facing massacre." Well, yeah, I mean, they're facing massacre if they don't surrender. If there's no obligation on the part of the Russian to spare the Ukrainian armed forces from massacre. There is an obligation on the part of the Russians to observe humanitarian law, but if soldiers are not giving up their arms, they're refusing to surrender, then there's absolutely no need to consider any kind of humanitarian considerations. And I think that's what Putin rightly said. Hey, if you want their lives to be spared, Putin said to Trump, then tell them to surrender, give up their arms, and their lives will be spared, and they will be treated with appropriate humanitarianism. Anyway, then where are we? No, it's the wrong one. Yeah, and then Putin went on. That during the conversation, Donald Trump put forward a proposal for the parties to the conflict to mutually refrain from attacks on energy infrastructure facilities for 30 days. So notice, it's Trump who put forward the proposal for the parties to the conflict to mutually refrain from attacks on energy infrastructure facilities for 30 days. Vladimir Putin responded positively to this initiative and immediately gave the Russian military the corresponding order. So it looks like Putin's going ahead with this restraint on attacks on energy infrastructure. Now, there's nothing new about this. They'd been negotiating with these ceasefire on attacks on energy infrastructure for some time. And we're actually on the brink of an agreement in August of last year, just before Zelensky ordered the invasion of Kursk. So they were very close to a deal, but then Zelensky invaded Kursk, and that put an end to that deal. So there's nothing new about this. I mean, I guess since Ukraine isn't withdrawing from Kursk, then that may be a concession on the part of Russia to start talking about a cessation of attacks on energy infrastructure. But that's a modest way forward. But as I say, I haven't seen any indication that this was really that this was contributing anything to the final outcome. I mean, every time Russia launches these attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, I mean, there's power outages lasting for a few hours, and then everything is back online again in no time at all. So it doesn't look like much of a concession on the part of the Russians. But as I say, as at the moment, there's no news whether Ukraine will agree to this ceasefire, whether Ukraine will stop attacking Russian energy infrastructure. They may continue because I mean, I do think that it's probably hurting the Russians. These attacks on oil refineries are hurting Russia. Anyway, he goes on. The Russian president also responded constructively to Donald Trump's idea of implementing a well known initiative concerning the safety of navigation in the Black Sea. It was agreed to begin negotiations to further elaborate specific details for such an agreement. So that seems to be like talks about talks. Russia responded constructively to Donald Trump's idea of implementing a well known initiative concerning the safety of navigation in the Black Sea. It was agreed to begin negotiations to further elaborate specific details of such an agreement. So there'll be talks about talks to bring to an end the attacks in the Black Sea. So that's not something that's so the energy infrastructure refrain that's that looks like it's going ahead, at least from on Russia's side. Immediately, we'll see how Ukraine responds. As for the Black Sea, the restraint there, that's going to take a little bit of time. It just talks about talks. Then it says Vladimir Putin informed that on March the 19th, a prisoner exchange will be carried out between the Russian and Ukrainian side, 175 for 175 people. In addition, as a gesture of goodwill, 23 seriously wounded Ukrainian servicemen who are being treated in Russian medical institutions will be transferred. So that's a gesture of goodwill. Unilateral gesture. Again, we don't know whether Ukraine will agree to this. The leaders confirmed their intention to continue efforts to achieve a Ukrainian settlement in a bilateral mode, including taking into account the above mentioned proposals of the US president. For this purpose, Russian and American expert groups are being created. Well, that's quite an important issue because here they're talking about the long-term settlement, which is that's the important thing, beyond the immediate ceasefire, the long-term settlement, and the is going to be in a bilateral mode, including taking the above overview for this Russian and American. So the bilateral mode is the bilateral between the Russians and the Americans, and they're putting together expert groups. So there was already talk about that after the first meeting between Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, and Sergei Lavrov about the expert groups, but nothing much came of that. But we'll see whether now at last these expert groups will be created. But I mean, the point about the expert groups is that they'll be laying the foundation for a lasting settlement. And then Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump also touched upon other issues on the international agenda, including the situation in the Middle East and the Red Sea region. So the situation is quite dire in both cases. We've got Israel that has now formally abandoned the ceasefire. There's no more ceasefire. It's back to pulverizing Gaza. And then we have the Red Sea region where the Houthis um, once the ceasefire came to an end, relaunched their attacks, and now Americans are bombing the Houthis. So they've resumed the bombing of the Houthis. So there's things are quite hot in the Middle East and Red Sea region. Then joint efforts will be made to stabilize the situation in crisis areas, establish cooperation on nuclear non-proliferation and global security. This in turn will contribute to improving the overall atmosphere of Russian American relations. One positive example is the joint vote in the UN on the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. Yeah. So, this is improving the overall atmosphere of Russian American relations. It's nonetheless interesting that when it comes to the Middle East, um, the tone should be as if Russia and America are on the same page. They touched upon other issues in the situation in the Middle East and Red Sea region. Joint efforts will be made. So it is. I mean, it is quite remarkable that Russia, which supposedly has a strategic partnership with Iran, and Trump is explicitly threatening war against Iran. The truth that he sent out yesterday, saying that whatever the Houthis do, any attacks on shipping in the Red Sea by the Houthis will be the responsibility of Iran. And that whatever the Houthis do, we will absolutely direct our rage against Iran, because Iran is behind the Houthi attack. So Trump is explicitly threatening war against Iran, and yet you wouldn't get any sense of this from this Russian statement when they're talking about stabilizing the situation. Well, who's destabilizing the situation? America has now really escalated its rhetoric and its threats against Iran, and Iran is supposedly a strategic partner of Russia's, and Iran certainly has provided assistance and diplomatic support for Russia in Ukraine. And then we have mutual interest in normalizing bilateral relations was expressed in light of the special responsibility of Russia and the United States for ensuring security and stability in the world. There's also, if we go back to the where it says there, joint efforts will be made to stabilize the situation in crisis areas, establish cooperation on nuclear non-proliferation and global security. Well, it's what I mean. There's really on the issue of nuclear non-proliferation, and Russia and the United States are definitely not on the same page when it comes to Iran, because the Russian position is that Iran is not pursuing nuclear weapons. Iran has adhered to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and which is very different from the American position, which America insists, or at least the Trump administration insists, that Iran is hell-bent determined on acquiring nuclear weapons. So that's raised question about how much cooperation you can get when they don't really see eye to eye on Iran. And then so anyway, bilateral security and stability in the world. In this context, a wide range of areas in which our countries could establish interaction was considered. A number of ideas were discussed that are moving towards the development of mutually beneficial cooperation in the economy and energy sector. So again, this is something they talked about before, exploitation of Russia's mineral and energy resources. Donald Trump supported Vladimir Putin's idea to organize hockey matches in the USA and Russia, between Russian and American players playing in the NHL and KHL. That's not insignificant, incidentally. I know it seems like very trivial and childlike, but given the isolation that was imposed on Russia by the Western powers, chiefly the United States, from any kind of sporting, cultural, diplomatic contacts, for Trump to agree to organizing hockey matches in the USA and Russia, between Russian and American players, that's something. That's definitely breaking ranks with America's Western partners, and doing something that actually states that are want to have friendly relations with one another do. They play hockey, they play sport, they have cultural exchanges. All that has been absolutely denied and thwarted for the past 3 years. And it says the presidents agreed to remain in contact on all issues raised. So, in fact, that conclusion about the hockey was very much, the tone that the Russians and the Americans want to maintain and enhance their gradual warming of relations. So let's, yeah. I need to answer this. Anyway, so that's the Trumpian. I mean, from the Russian side. Now, from the American side. So this was the statement was issued by Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, and here's the readout from the Americans. And it says there that today, President Trump and President Putin spoke about the need for peace and a ceasefire in the Ukraine war. Both leaders agreed this conflict needs to end with a lasting peace. They also stressed the need for improved bilateral relations between the United States and Russia. The blood and treasure that both Ukraine and Russia have been spending in this war would be better spent on the needs of their people. Okay, blood and treasure. Okay, so that's the American take. That wasn't quite expressed in that way in the Kremlin readout, and so. Okay, and then goes on. This conflict should never have started. Again, this is Trumpism, and should have been ended long ago with sincere and good faith peace efforts. The leaders agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea. So that is so that was in the Kremlin readout. It's in the American readout. They agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea. That's it's in both readouts. Full ceasefire and permanent peace. Well, that's certainly a desirable outcome, but that's that's some way off, and the Kremlin, and he said, "Well, that's yeah, we'd like to head towards that, but you have to start addressing our security concerns, and we have to get to the root causes of this war." That's a full success. So the American readout makes it sound as if, well, this is the first stages, and then we're going to get to a full ceasefire and permanent peace. Whereas the Russians said, yeah, but we can get there, but we're gonna have to address the root causes of this conflict, and then these negotiations will begin immediately in the Middle East. Um, I guess they mean negotiations will begin immediately in Saudi Arabia. All right. The leaders spoke broadly about the Middle East as a region of potential cooperation to prevent future conflicts. They further discuss a potential future conflict. There's already war going on now, in which the United States is very actively involved. So the fighting in Gaza and this bombing of the Houthis. So to future conflicts, they further discussed the need to stop proliferation of strategic weapons, and will engage with others to ensure the broadest possible application. Now, that is a little odd, because in the Kremlin readout they talked about nuclear non-proliferation, which sounded as if they were talking about Iran, um, not preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. But here they're talking about proliferation of strategic weapons, which suggests they're talking about arms control between the two nuclear superpowers, United States and Russia, and then will engage with others to ensure the broadest possible application. What do they mean with others? I mean, so that's a little, to me, it's a little confusing what they mean there. Because do they mean that others have to take part in the negotiations about strategic weapons, which means China primarily, but maybe also the British and the French? The two leaders shared the view that Iran should never be in a position to destroy Israel. Notice that they put that in. This is the American readout. There's nothing whatever in that. There's nothing at all remotely like that in the Kremlin readout. They talked about not, as I say, the non-proliferation, but they never said anything that Iran should never be in a position to destroy Israel. That's clearly an American position. But the way this is formulated is that the two leaders shared the view that Iran. So it wasn't like Donald Trump insisted that Iran should never be in a position to destroy Israel. It says the two leaders shared the view. So that would be quite interesting whether did Putin really sign on to that, because there's no indication of that in the Kremlin readout. And then it says the two leaders agreed that a future with an improved bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia has a huge upside. And then this includes economic deals, enormous economic deals, and geopolitical stability when peace has been achieved. And so that's the Caroline Leavitt readout. And then Trump sent out a truth. He says, my phone conversation today with President Trump of Russia was a very good and productive one. We agreed to an immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure, with an understanding that we will be working quickly to have a complete ceasefire. See, we will be working quickly. There was no understanding that they'll be working quickly. Putin explained what would be the basis of a complete ceasefire, namely the addressing the root causes, which is obviously NATO expansion, the nature of the regime in Kiev, and a consideration of Russia's security concerns. And ultimately, an end to this very horrible war between Russia and Ukraine. This war would have never started if I were president. Many elements of a contract for peace were discussed, including the fact that thousands of soldiers are being killed. And both President Putin and President Zelensky would like to see it end. Um, that was not that was definitely not in the Russian readout. They never said that President Zelensky would like to see it end. And then that process is now in full force and effect, and we will hopefully, for the sake of humanity, get the job done. So, what's interesting about the American readout and then Trump's truth is the obvious optimistic tone that he adopts. And Trump had a very optimistic tone going into this phone conversation because he said, "Well, we're well along in our negotiations for a lasting ceasefire. We're well along." Um, and and so here again, he seems to be optimistic, where Russia just seems to say, well, we can make a start, but nothing new. I mean, as I say, this thing about the cessation of attacks on energy infrastructure. That's been negotiated and negotiating for months, and was on the brink of getting done before the August Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. So the question then, where does this leave us? I think we can say that the first of all, obviously, the process of negotiation and improvement in bilateral relations between Russia and the United States is ongoing. It started really very, very early on in Trump 47 term that he intended to do this. This continued with the phone conversation between Trump-Putin. The first one, that is on February the 12th. It continued with the meeting in Riyadh between Lavrov and Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz. So clearly that the project of normalizing diplomatic relations is continued. There seem to be goodwill gestures here. I mean, particularly the project for these hockey matches. Something Trump obviously likes. He's a big sport fan, so he would enjoy that. And there's the cessation of attacks on energy infrastructure. Nothing new in that. But the basic problems remain, and I don't see from anything in this conversation that that there's any move towards addressing Russia's serious security concerns. Because I think Russia politely has come back to the Americans and said, well, we're not going to accept a ceasefire unless certain conditions are observed. The mobilization of Ukrainians has to stop. Training of Ukrainian forces has to stop. Above all, the delivery of arms and intelligence to Ukraine has to stop. And then, maybe we can talk about a ceasefire. And the Russians brought up the Kursk issue. Trump didn't bring it up. So Trump, who had sent out that truth last Friday, saying, "Oh, the Ukrainians are about to be massacred," though he didn't mention Kursk, but they're about to be massacred. And I urge Putin to spare their lives. And then and again, so Putin again says, "Well, really appreciate your humanitarian concern, but there's a very simple solution. They have to surrender, and that I think is definitely a big stumbling block. There can't be any kind of a ceasefire, um, 30-day or whatever, as long as there are Ukrainian forces in Kursk, and therefore that will be some kind of a bargaining chip on the part of the Ukrainians and on the part of the West. So hey, we got we'll leave course if you give up certain land in Ukraine. So the problem now, Trump comes out of this phone conversation in a positive frame of mind. However, once he's really thought about it, I would imagine he's going to realize, well, we really haven't made very much progress. This cessation of attacks on the Ukrainian infrastructure is that's it's something that's done, and but then we don't know whether Ukraine will sign on to this. So with Trump, we really don't know which way he's going to go, because he basically could go either way. I mean, at this stage, we've been, he started off in the very earliest days of the administration when he seemed to be blaming Russia and was threatening Russia with some kind of sanctions and tariffs. Then he switched over and blamed Zelensky. Then after the negotiation in Jeddah, he said, "Oh, Ukraine is interested in peace. Therefore, I'm lifting the arms flow stoppage and the intelligence flow stoppage." So now his 30-day ceasefire plan doesn't seem to be going very far. I mean, so this, the ban on any more attacks on energy infrastructure, that's a long way from the 30-day ceasefire. So we'll see how it goes. I think that this would it's made some progress, but it's clearly nowhere near as positive as some of us had hoped, that we somehow would be making serious progress towards a peaceful outcome. So we're a long way from that, but still, American-Russian relations are reasonably friendly, and we can still build on that. Who knows what might happen? But as things stand, the 30-day ceasefire, we're not making much progress on that. Anyway, so that's the one item on the news. The other item is obviously the this fight that's taken place with the Trump's deportation order. So Trump has been having these fights with the judges, who were these ridiculous district court judges who have not been elected to anything, and but have decided that they can just from the bench just simply overturn presidential decisions, and And obviously this is quite ridiculous. That's not how any government is supposed to work, let alone a democratic government. A democratic government, you have elected leaders, and elected leaders are entrusted with executive actions. And in particular, in the United States, where there's really only one leader who is elected by the nation as a whole, the president. And the president sets national policy, the president sets foreign policy, and the president sets, above all, immigration policy. The president is the one who decides whether, who and whether anyone can stay in the United States and who has to go. And yet the judge, have decided that they can intervene, and they know better than the president. And so we have this Judge Boasberg from the D.C. court judge, who basically said, no, the president cannot deport Venezuelan gang members. He failed, but he failed in any way to explain on what basis. He just put a stop on it, but failed to explain in what way the president was doing anything at all wrong, illegal or unconstitutional, by deporting gang members. Now, so I want to first of all show what the president did is he invoked the Alien Enemies Act from 1798. This is really hilarious because what we have is the media who are all going around. This is not it. The media which repeat in a this is it. Yeah. They repeat that, oh, this is an act from the 18th century, so therefore it can have no validity. Well, the U.S. Constitution is also from the 18th century, and that's the binding law in the United States. So the fact that it's 1798 is neither here nor there. But the point is that here is this act, the Alien Enemies Act. And it says here, Section 1, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that whenever there shall be a declared war between the United States and any foreign national government, or any invasion or predatory incursion shall be perpetrated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the United States by any foreign national government, and the President of the United States shall make public proclamation of the event, all natives, citizens, denizens, or subjects of the hostile nation or government, being males of the age of 14 years and upwards, who shall be within the United States and not actually naturalized, shall be liable to be apprehended, restrained, secured, and removed as alien enemies. So there it is. That's what he says here. That whenever there shall be a declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government, or any invasion or predatory incursion shall be perpetrated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the United States by any foreign nation or government, and the President shall make a public proclamation of the event, then all natives, citizens, denizens, or subjects of the hostile nations or government, being males of the age of 14 years and upwards, who shall be within the United States and not actually naturalized, shall be liable to apprehended, restrained, secured, and removed as alien enemies. So that's pretty explicit. He says that there it is. I have the power under the Alien Enemies Act, and therefore all these ridiculous people on CNN and MSNBC. Oh, well, according to the Alien Enemies Act, there has to be a state of war before that can be invoked. Well, it doesn't say that there has to be a state of war. Let's read that again. It's very important. Oh, it has to be a state of war. There's no state of war between the United States and Venezuela. It doesn't have to be a state of war. Here it is. Say it again. That whenever there shall be a declared war between the United States and any foreign national government, or any invasion or predatory incursion shall be perpetrated, attempt, or threatened against the territory of the United States. That's it. Then he can just simply remove people from that. I see somebody says 228 years ago. So what? I mean, when was the Constitution enacted? I mean, you're talking about the Declaration of Independence of 1776. That's 250 years ago. The Constitution is 1789. And so you're talking about 1787 rather. And so you're talking about that. That all these are the laws who are all of which are more than 200 years old. They are the guiding principles of the United States. So, the fact that 1798 is neither here nor there. But the point is that this judge Boasberg, presented no reason why what his objection was for Trump to remove these people from U.S. territory, other than that he didn't like it. This is an Obama-appointed judge, a rather nasty judge. This is a person who sent January the 6th to prison on a fairly crisp, regular basis. Very harsh, sending elderly women to prison. For them, he had very little sympathy, but then, but here he suddenly, he's full of the milk of human kindness for these gang members. But anyway, he issued this order on Saturday evening. He first issued a verbal order, and then he issued a written order. Now it looks as if two of the planes set off on the basis of the verbal order. The timeline isn't entirely clear, but it looks like he issued a verbal, an oral order. The planes took off, and then there was the written order, which was published, I think, about 7:30 p.m. local time on Saturday. And now, but by that time, those planes were already outside of U.S. airspace, and so at that stage, even if you were to say that he demanded that the planes return, his jurisdiction had already run out, because the planes were outside of U.S. airspace, and therefore his order had no validity. And apart from anything else, all of this is part of the president's enunciated powers according to Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And the judge cannot go around second guessing the president's actions. And that's the point. It's like saying, well, some little judge in the district court can tell where an aircraft carrier can go, where U.S. Air Force can send its aircraft, what he can bomb, what he can't bomb. No, I mean, he really can't. And so the media have gone into this tailspin, but they haven't even read the operating legislation. The legislation did not say there has to be, first of all, a state of war. It says a predatory incursion, and that's kind of what Trump is claiming. But above all, the issue of immigration does fall clearly within the powers of the president, as explicitly articulated in Article 2 of the Constitution. Judges cannot go ahead and do things like this and say, "Well, I can decide. I know better than the president." There's nowhere in the Constitution where core powers of the president can be usurped by judges. It was never there. It was never there that saying that this is subject to judicial review. It's like saying the president ordering a military attack is subject to judicial review. It's not just subject to judicial review. It's not. That's not what judges do. Judges are only supposed to essentially preside over trials in their courtroom. That's all they do. They're there with plaintiffs, bring cases against defendants. The judge is supposed to ensure fair play. Prosecutors can bring criminal charges against accused. Again, the judge is supposed to preside over the proceedings and ensure that there's fair play for both sides. The judge can't just simply usurp the powers that are articulated in Article 2 of the Constitution. And this is what we've come to with these with these ridiculous judges who basically have just taken it upon themselves to run the country. Now, of course, we've got all the CNN and MSNBC, they're lapping it up, but it's just stupid. It's clearly a violation of the Constitution. And they talk about, Trump is violating the separation of powers. No, it is precisely Trump who's insisting upon the separation of powers. And therefore, these are the powers of the president, these are the powers of the legislature, and these are the powers of the judges. And you can't have judges just simply ruling the country from the bench. But anyway, so we had this. That's the Alien Enemies Act, and then we had the Trump Proclamation, which is required. It says the proclamation from the president, and here's Trump's proclamation based upon a review of the TDA. That's the Venezuelan criminal gang, and in consultation with the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Treasury on February the 20th, 2025, acting pursuant to the authority in 8 U.S.C. 1189, the Secretary of State designated TDA as a foreign terrorist organization. As President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief, it is my solemn duty to protect the American people from the devastating effects of this invasion. Now, therefore, I, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America, by the authority vested in me by the Constitution and the laws of the United States, hereby proclaim and direct as follows. Section 1, I find and declare that TDA is perpetrating, attempting, and threatening an invasion or predatory incursion. See, that's the word, the predatory incursion in the Alien Enemies Act against the territory of the United States. TDA is undertaking hostile actions and conducting irregular warfare against the territory of the United States, both directly and at the direction, clandestine or otherwise, of the Maduro regime in Venezuela, and so on and so forth. And I proclaim that all Venezuelan citizens 14 years of age or older who are members of the TDA are within the United States and are not actually naturalized or lawful permanent residents. So, they're going word for word according to that Alien Enemies Act, as we just saw. Are liable to be apprehended, restrained, and secured, and removed as alien enemies, and so on. And then after that was the basis on which they were removed. And then Trump then sent out this truth saying the radical left lunatic of a judge, a troublemaker and agitator who was sadly appointed by Barack Hussein Obama, was not elected president. He didn't win the popular vote by a lot. He says by a lot. He didn't win all 7 swing states. He didn't win 2,750 to 525 counties. He didn't win anything. I won for many reasons in an overwhelming mandate, but fighting illegal immigration may have been the number one reason for this historic victory. I'm just doing what the voters wanted me to do. The judge, like many of the crooked judges I'm forced to appear before, should be impeached. The judge should be impeached. We don't want vicious, violent, and demented criminals, many of them deranged murderers, in our country, make America great again. Again, Trump has his own way of speaking, but of course he's absolutely right. This is absolutely falls within his core responsibilities. That's what the election was about. He ran very explicitly on the platform of removing migrants who are illegally in the country and doing this in a at a crisp pace. That he is that's what people wanted from him, and there's really very little the judges can do about this. And in this case, he had a law. He declared it, and for this judge to start arguing, first of all, that this judge can second guess the president, even though it's hard to see how he can second guess the president. The president's invoking the Alien Enemies Act, but the judge can second guess him. But the remarkable thing is that the judge really hasn't come up with a reason. In all of this talk, there's still no explanation on what basis do you question Trump's right to do this. And then he says, and then afterwards, when the planes had already taken off, he said that, well, I have a right to call them back, even though the planes were already not in U.S. airspace. I mean, so what now this judge, has authority over international airspace, a district court judge. That's all. He's just in one district court. Now, this nonsense, and we talked about this yesterday, this nonsense has now been going on for quite a while, whereby judges rule and decide that they can rule from the bench. That they don't have to pay any attention to any other branch of government, and they rule from the bench, and the media just repeats this and say, well, if that's what the judge ruled, there's nothing you can do about it unless you go and appeal to another judge. But even if that's the case, that means ultimately the only people who matter in the United States are judges, unelected judges. Because if the only way you can deal with this judge is by going to another judge, and then this other judge, chances are, if he's in the district in the D.C. court, he's going to have the same politics as this judge. This is a highly political judge. I mean, this to say he was involved in the January 6 cases. He was on the FISA court. He was in the FISA court that moved against Carter Page. That actually came up with this. He didn't bother to check the validity of the FISA warrant against Carter Page. So this is a highly political judge who, and as Trump said, he hasn't run for office, he hasn't been elected to anything, and he said, well, I can do it. I can just run the country. I can just decide immigration policy for the entire country. Now, this should have been brought under control a long time ago. The Supreme Court should have made it clear that judges cannot usurp the powers of the executive. That's just not their function. They cannot, the powers of the judiciary are articulated in Article 3 of the Constitution. The powers of the president, Article 2, is the separation of powers, mean the judges cannot run the country. And the Supreme Court should have made this clear a long time ago, but instead, they kept their mouth shut until today, when Chief Justice John Roberts weighed in. That's an amazing thing. He weighed in. And he didn't weigh in saying, we really can't have judges, adopting Article 2 powers. No, on the contrary, he weighed in against Trump. And here is the weighing in from Chief Justice Roberts. He says, just hours after President Trump, this is from the New York Times, just hours after President Trump called for the impeachment of a judge who sought to pause the removal of more than 200 migrants to El Salvador, Chief Justice John Roberts issued a rare public statement. And then here's a rare public statement. For more than 2 centuries, the Chief Justice said, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose. So let's read that again. For more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose. Now, Roberts really had no business weighing in this way. Roberts needs to weigh in on the question of the judges, whether judges on the district courts or the judges in the appellate courts. That's Roberts's responsibility to make sure that the judiciary branch is functioning properly. Instead, Roberts weighed in on something that doesn't really have anything to do with him. Impeachment is a perfectly legitimate process. It is one that is enacted by legislators. You may not like it. Judges may not like it. Or anyone may not like it, may not like the whole process of impeachment. But nonetheless, it's a remedy that is applied not by Roberts, not by anyone on the Supreme Court, and not by anyone within the judiciary. It's applied by legislators. And if legislators, at the behest of President Trump, decide to impeach any judge, then that's bad. Then it falls within their responsibilities. It has nothing to do with Roberts. Roberts had absolutely no business weighing in this way, and essentially taking the side of a shitty little judge, just a district court judge, a little judge, against the President of the United States. And this is a fairly obvious point, because I don't know if you recall when the Supreme Court ruled in that the case of the super PAC case, that there were to be no restraints on campaign spending. I forgot the name of that particular ruling. But Obama was very critical of that, essentially the Supreme Court saying, according to the First Amendment, you really can't restrain spending on political campaigns. So Obama delivered the State of the Union, and he brought up the recent ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court that there should be no limits to campaign spending. And he condemned this. Obama, in his State of the Union, condemned the Supreme Court decision. And this is the State of the Union. And there was Justice Samuel Alito, who was there sitting, because the State of the Union, all the 9 justices are there. And Alito started shaking his head while Obama was condemning that decision. Alito started shaking his head, obviously denoting his disagreement with what Obama was saying. And there was enormous uproar about this. How dare Alito publicly demonstrate his disagreement with the President of the United States. The President of the United States is perfectly entitled to criticize any Supreme Court decision that he doesn't like. That's part of his core responsibilities. The justices are just supposed to sit there and take it. They're not supposed to nod in agreement or to shake their heads in disagreement. They're supposed to just take it. And even, Jonathan Turley was a very, level-headed, very reasonable person, said, he was very harshly critical of Alito. Alito had no business shaking his head in disagreement. And that is exactly the point. Roberts has particular responsibility. It is not up to Roberts to start weighing in whether legislators are going to impeach a judge. Absolutely not. It's within the legislators' responsibility. If they don't like a judge, they can go ahead and impeach him. And in fact, it's actually a pretty good form of discipline. I think it's one of the problems we've had is that judges have been getting away with murder, and legislators have not been exercising their core responsibilities, and they've not been essentially moving to impeach judges who should have been impeached. The judges were clearly abusing their powers, as is this judge. This Boasberg was abusing his powers, usurping the authority of the president, and Roberts should have just kept his mouth shut. You may not like it, but for the same reason, Alito didn't like what Obama said about that Supreme Court ruling, but he should have kept his mouth shut. He shouldn't have been shaking his head in disagreement. And that's what everybody said at the time. But now everybody's gleeful that Roberts is getting involved in politics and criticizing the president. None of his business. Absolutely none of his business. He has none of his business to criticize. The president is perfectly entitled to call for the impeachment of a judge he doesn't like. And he can't do it himself. The president can't impeach, obviously, himself. But, one of his supporters in Congress can attempt to do so. That's within their core responsibilities. It has nothing to do with Roberts. Roberts made an absolute fool of himself to weigh in this way. I think what he did was worse than what Alito did, because Alito just simply shook his head. He didn't say anything. He just shook his head in disagreement with Obama. But here, Roberts is thrusting himself into a political debate when he has no business. If he has a judicial decision to make a judicial decision. But he's weighing in on a political debate. The Chief Justice has no business doing that. And incidentally, one should also say about that clearly immigration is a federal government responsibility, and everybody knew this is a federal government responsibility at the time when, if you recall, Governor Greg Abbott started putting up wire fencing around the state to prevent migrants coming into Texas, and the Supreme Court ordered that the barbed wire be taken down. He didn't take it down, and they essentially sent in a National Guard to take down the fencing that Abbott had put up. And the Supreme Court ruled, yeah, absolutely right. The federal government is absolutely within its right to take down the fencing and thereby allowing illegal migration into Texas, because the issue of who comes into the country and who doesn't, and the migration policy and whatever, is entirely the responsibility of the federal government. And everybody was gleeful and delighted that the Supreme Court essentially slapped down Governor Greg Abbott and took down and supported the taking down of the fence. Anyway, let's take a look at our locals page. So that, there's the people who keep the dogs, happy, to the extent that these dogs can be happy, but they try to maintain the dogs on an even keel. So let's take a look here. So Judy Hotchkiss, always very good to see you, Judy. Always find comments really interesting and insightful. Let me just always locals is always so hard. Okay, let's see. Yeah, all right. So Judy says, I was particularly interested in this part of the Kremlin readout. Putin and Trump also discussed broader international issues, including the situation in the Middle East and the Red Sea region. Yeah, we read that. They agreed to coordinate efforts to stabilize crisis areas and enhance cooperation on nuclear non-proliferation and global security, which in turn would improve the overall state of U.S.-Russia relations. That is interesting, and it's clear that this is what Trump is presenting the Russians. I mean, he's essentially saying that if we can just get this war out of the way, this Ukraine conflict, this really stupid war, there's a possibility of our working on a long-term partnership. And obviously, the Middle East is one area. The Red Sea region. Then talked about this economic cooperation, nuclear non-proliferation. I'm assuming that when they're talking about the nuclear non-proliferation, it means non-proliferation as far as non-nuclear states is concerned. In other words, it applies to Iran. It doesn't mean non-proliferation within the states themselves. In other words, not against arms races. Neither Russia nor the United States will engage in an arms race. Proliferation, having more and more nuclear weapons. I assume that they're talking about non-proliferation means non-nuclear states acquiring nuclear weapons. The problem with that partnership is that I'm not sure how helpful that's going to be for Russia, because what Trump obviously is looking for is Russia applying pressure on Iran, both on the nuclear issue and on the regional issue, namely that Iran essentially rids itself of its various regional allies. I mean, there's Hezbollah, but Hezbollah is obviously much diminished. They have some allies in Iraq, but now their key ally is the Houthis. And I guess, the Americans at least regard Hamas as an Iranian ally, though I really don't know to what extent Iran really has much sway with Hamas. I don't think Iran ever signed off on the October the 7th attack. I think that was just such a reckless action. It's very unlikely Iran would have thought this was a good idea. So if Russia goes along with this, then Russia would be hurting its relations with Iran. I mean, America has a very specific goal in mind when it comes to Iran. It wants Iran severely diminished, damaged, and weakened to the point of irrelevance. That's the Israeli goal, and that's the American goal. Now, as Trump would like to say, well, we can do it the easy way or we can do it the hard way. The easy way for the Americans would be to get the Russians to cooperate on bringing Iran to heel. I don't think that's a good idea for Russia. Iran is potentially a crucial ally for Russia, and if Russia obviously still has aspirations to be a great power, then it has to, at the very least, project power in the Middle East. With the loss of Syria, that only leaves Iran. That's really the only means by Russia can still maintain itself as a great power in the Middle East. I mean, elsewhere, Russia, I think, is very much losing its allies. I mean, it's losing its allies in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, but here it has an ally in Iran. So I think the Americans want something from Iran, and while the Russians will say, yeah, non-proliferation, that's standard Russian policy, the Americans want something far more than that, and that's why there was the difference between what the Kremlin readout, and what Judy, what you have here is from the Kremlin readout and from the American readout, because the American readout said, oh well, we both agreed, both presidents agreed that they will not tolerate America, whatever it was, America destroying Israel. Iran destroying Israel. Neither America nor Russia would tolerate Iran destroying Israel. That's not. I mean, that's not in the Russian readout. The Americans put that in, and it's clear what the Americans want. They want to do in Iran, and that's the Israel agenda. That goes together with Trump's threat to go to war against Iran, and saying any attack emanating from the Houthis will be taken to be a direct attack by Iran on the United States. That's a very different agenda from that of Russia, which would suggest to me that there's going to be a limit to what any real cooperation between the Americans or Russians when it comes to Iran, unless I think Russia abandons its ally, which I think will be a very serious drawback for Russia. Russia really badly needs Iran. Iran is potentially a major player in the Middle East. It's an ally, and at this stage, I think Russia really needs needs as many allies as it can get, including North Korea. So I have my doubts whether this partnership on in the Middle East and the Red Sea, again, this is they want to use Iran to do in the Houthis, and then use the Russians to do in Iran. Anyway, thank you so much, Judy, as always, for your comments and for your insights and for your generosity. And Vic Shakapopoulos says, I disagree with your take on the Serbian protests. One of my friends studies in the faculty where it all started. The people go out to protest for a genuine reason, and the movement grew because of the mistakes made by the Serbian state and tried to quickly find a scapegoat instead of doing a thorough investigation. Well, look, the question is, what are these protests achieving? To me, it seems they're not achieving anything. I mean, it's essentially mass protests which happen week after week. It's an ongoing thing. Schools are not functioning, so children are, basically children in state schools, they're not getting an education. Students in universities are not getting an education, so they've put money in, and they're not getting anything out of it. They're going to have to redo these classes. Public transport isn't really working. Where is this going? What are they trying to accomplish? I mean, you always have to, whenever you have a movement, what are you trying to accomplish? Just simply saying, oh, we don't like it, we're going to protest. Then how are you going to do it? And that's why I just really have doubts what these protests are really about. And whenever you have this movement, like, well, we're just regularly protesting, then you think, well, with a view to what? And then, it's that famous Ed Banfield from the 1960s, when he asked, well, why do people riot? He says, well, they riot for fun and for profit. And so when this goes on and on for weeks and months and months and months, and it has really nothing to do with the original event, which was this, obviously, the shoddy workmanship that led to this horrible accident, and you just keep protesting, then you think, well, obviously either you've got people there who just keep protesting without any agenda behind it, without any any real prospect of achieving any attainable goal, other than that they're clearly trying to overturn Vucic. And I know they're going to say, oh, no, we're not really doing that. But what else is it? I mean, what else? I mean, what does any of this got to do with what happened at Novi Sad station? How in any way are any of these protests going to rectify the problems that took place in Novi Sad. So there's obviously some agenda behind this. Um, and I have to say, yeah, when there are these ongoing protests, and there doesn't seem to be any clear objective, no program, then I get very suspicious. And I say this as someone who has never been a big fan of Vucic. And again, you can look it up here on Locals when I did an interview with, I guess it was in January, with Dragana Trifkovic, and we were both very critical of Vucic. Said a lot of very negative things about him. I don't think he's been a great leader. That doesn't mean that I think highly of the protesters. And so it's not. I think they both merit criticism, and I think the idea that just because people don't like Vucic, they support this pointless, and it's completely pointless. These protests, they're not accomplishing anything other than, I guess, just destabilizing Serbia. And I do remember what these protests, these constant mass protests, did in the 1990s. They destabilized and ultimately destroyed Serbia. And they completely weakened, undermined Serbia, and Serbia lost everything. They lost everything. They lost Kosovo, they lost Montenegro, and they lost their common state of Yugoslavia. And it was done by these constant, these mischievous, malevolent-minded leaders like Zoran Djindjic and Vuk Draskovic, who also were having these regular mass protests, which basically, as I say, destroyed the country. Serbia has never recovered from that, and never will recover from that. Anyway, Ivan Grozny, always good to see you. Said, how's it going, George? Yeah, fine, thank you. So, how much longer do you think the fighting will go on? What will Russia and Ukraine look like geographically at the agreement? Well, to be honest, after the today's phone conversation, I would say it's going to go on for a while. I don't see any easy resolution anytime soon. There's because I don't think they, if they had agreed, if they could find some basis to agree on a 30-day ceasefire, then we would get somewhere, and we'd be moving on to phase two. We're not there, which means that it's going to go on. If it goes on, then all the dangers continue. Trump could then escalate with his support for Ukraine. The Europeans will escalate with their support for Ukraine. And then we're just back to where we were, just this ongoing war. And no doubt, Russia can go on grinding out, it's inch by inch, foot by foot progress in Ukraine, but at a huge loss, a huge rate of deaths and so on. So I have to say, today after this phone call, I'm far less optimistic than I was last week. So I don't, at the moment, just today on Tuesday, the 18th, I have to say I'm a little pessimistic. I now really don't see any real progress on any front. So. And then Viktor Kapopoulos says, now the protests grew with general dissatisfaction with Vucic, as he has enemies on each side of the political spectrum. And because the premise of the protest is rather apolitical, it easily attracts citizens regardless of their views. And the protesters have a simple list of goals. It is not a protest with no aims, as you said in the live stream yesterday. Well, it is a protest with no aims. How are you achieving anything at all by preventing schools from functioning, by preventing classes in universities, by constant strikes? I don't know what exactly they're accomplishing. When you say something like, "Oh, well, we're going to end corruption," I mean, these are nebulous things. I mean, well, you're going to end corruption. Yeah, I want to end corruption. I want to end sin. I mean, this just doesn't mean anything. I mean, of course, there's always going to be corruption. There's corruption everywhere. It means nothing. Now, Vucic has, or at least there have been people arrested who allegedly were involved in that in that shoddy workmanship in the concrete canopy on that railway station in Novi Sad. There were, I don't know what's going to happen there, but there've been people. There've been 11. There've been 13 people have been indicted. We'll see what happens in the trial. There's nothing more you can do with that. I mean, it's like, people want to get somewhere with this, but it's it is what it is. It was a bad job. Corruption absolutely played a role, but the you're not just going to get rectify these problems of corruption by essentially preventing children from getting an education. That's not the way the world works. So oh well, I want to end corruption. Well, yeah, who doesn't? So this is the what this is achieving is I think weakening Serbia, and it will. I tend to think it's going to end badly, as it always does, as in the past. The demands include publishing all the documents regarding the reconstruction of the railway station, dismissal of public officials who physically assaulted students and professors, the dismissal of charges against any arrested students, and a 20% increase in spending on higher education. Well, as I say, I mean, presumably these various trials will clarify somewhere about this with the documents. Um, uh, yeah, I would think that the dismissal of public officials, nobody really believes that if any of this was. I mean, I'm not saying whether these goals are in and of themselves unreasonable, but that's not really what all this is about. Um, and I'm just finding it amusing, the 20% increase in spending on higher education at the very moment when essentially all the teachers are on strikes, and thereby preventing the students from getting an education. Yeah, so you want a 20% increase in higher education, while essentially their pupils are going to have to do this year again next year. Yeah, I can see that. That's the right way of going about it. Um, you say, I don't think the Serbian society will fall for a color revolution again. I wouldn't have said that. That's just color revolutions have they're an ongoing thing. Ukraine fell for it easily. Um, uh, well, we'll obviously we'd have to see. I would say that the, the this this is an ongoing thing. If this was just a one-off, this concrete canopy. A year ago, we had these mass demonstrations about the mass shooting in a school. Remember, there was that schoolboy, and it was a tragic case. It was a schoolboy killed. I don't know how many, nine other children. It was horrible. And then again, there's massive protests. Day after day, week after the week of mass protests, so somehow it was Vucic's fault. How is this Vucic's fault? So this is also Vucic's fault. Then before that there were the mass protests about the lithium mining. I mean, at least there it was. You could say more or less it was Vucic's fault. It's of course you all the time you're kind of creating these mass protests. And then you say, well, they won't fall for a color revolution. That's where it's heading. So who knows how it's going to go. I'd say, given what happened in the 90s, given what happened all the way up, to the in the 2000s, when essentially the Kosovo government, the Serbian government, just signed off on the theft of Kosovo. Um, I'd be very, very wary. I'd be very cautious and think that they're going to try this again. And why will they try this again? Because they failed. NATO failed in Serbia. They failed in Bosnia Herzegovina. What they tried to do in the 90s, they didn't pull off. They got halfway there, but it wasn't enough. They managed to get Milosevic out, but that wasn't enough. But they wanted more. They wanted a recognition of independence of Kosovo, and they wanted uh, Serbia to distance itself from Russia once and for all, align its foreign policy with the EU and the United States. They didn't accomplish that. Just like in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they wanted to create a unitary state that would then move into NATO. They didn't accomplish that. And so they're still working on it. Whatever the grievances are, I don't doubt that there are genuine grievances and corruption is rife and so on. But this is undoubtedly the making of a color revolution, irrespective of whether it'll succeed or not. That's a separate issue. This is the making of a color revolution. Anyway, thank you, Vic. Don Viejo says Europe's a museum with leaders you can't see them. Trump's a game show, Carney with lies and blarney. There's no prizes, but it's all play to play. Oh, that's good. And then Laura, good, Laura Ott, I think now saying something along my lines, agreeing with me. She says, seems like months-long protests just for simple conditions are a bit too much. Don't like Vucic either, yes, but got to wonder what would come next. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is just an ongoing thing. I mean, like, as I say, when it was those mass shootings, somehow that was Vucic's fault, and there were the same mass protests about this horrific mass shooting, as if somehow it's his fault about when this little boy killed all these people in school. So now again, just ongoing, week after week, just the country's becoming more and more kind of non-functioning, ungovernable, and we kind of remember the 90s. Where did that lead? The Serbs destroyed themselves. What in the 90s? Anyway, and then Laura goes on, don't like Vucic either, but got to wonder what would come next, and have to consider it also in the context of protests in Slovakia and now in Hungary as well. Very good point. Yeah, there's clearly these protests ongoing against Orban in preparation, I think, they'd love to get him out, just like they would love to get Fico out. We saw what happened in Romania. The prevention of undesired candidates from running, and then looks like those who are not fully committed to EU's political and military goals will see more of this. I absolutely agree with you. If you look at those countries from a logistics point of view, they're kind of in the middle of everything. I absolutely agree with you. It's that's exactly how it is. Why Serbia? I think, why really? Just like that. Oh, it's corruption. The only country where there's corruption, rather than it's one of the few countries in Europe that actually is been friendly and supportive of Russia. One of the few countries in Europe that is actually that refuses to go along with the NATO program of the theft of Kosovo and preventing Bosnia and Herzegovina joining NATO. If you want to have further confirmation, look in the pages of The Guardian and Politico. Almost every other day, they're ranting and ranting about the Serbs and that we have to bring the Serbs to heel, just as we did in the 90s. Why are they saying this? Why are they running these articles? We have to bring the Serbs to heel now. Does it really have nothing to do with these mass protests in Serbia? Anyway, Marks 2023 says, George, I had a look at the first hearing in the Kangaroo ICC political court. Not impressed with Duterte lawyer. Also, Duterte looked well and an old 79. No other countries are speaking out to protest his unlawful arrest. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, the lawyers in the defense lawyers are generally really very very unimpressive. You know that. And yeah, he's elderly. Really, 79-year-old man really shouldn't be in that position. Um, and all right. Um, and Marty, always very good to see you. Happy Tuesday, George and Gagglers. Um, and Mark says the American economy is 80% service and financial. America once was a main exporter of farm products. America is still a major exporter of farm products. Um, and you know, so Trump's doing what he did in the bombing, sanctions, threats, bypass. So yeah, well, I think you know you have you have to start somewhere. You have to try and do something. You can't just simply accept if you're an American president any kind of American economic decline. So whether that you know, I mean, I don't. I think you're a little overstating the extent of the American economic decline, but there is no question there is economic decline. But that's why he was voted into power. So. Um, and then Anne Marie says, "Good evening, George and Gaggers." Anne Marie, always very good to see you. I haven't um, read. I don't know if we've managed had time to listen to the John Adams music and what you think of that. I mean, I'd really be interested in because my selection of John Adams is this is about the first time we've had a a contemporary classical composer, and I'd be interested in what you think. I mean, I liked it, but I can see not everyone might like John Adams. So I'd be interested, Anne Marie, in your thoughts about him. Um, Marty says your view on Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. I have to say, I'm very unimpressed with how he came to power. And it really, you know, Canada's become like Italy, you know, wherever they have the central banker in Italy, Mario Draghi. So you have an election, and then you just cancel the election and you bring in a complete unelected technocrat, a central banker like Mario Draghi, in this case Mark Carney, and you install him as prime minister. He hasn't run for anything. He hasn't been elected to anything, and he's now the prime minister. But I have to say that the conservative. I always have difficulties pronouncing his name. He seems a very very unimpressive figure. Um, uh, there's a lot of interesting questions that I love to answer, but unfortunately, I have to do a. I have to appear on RT to talk about today's phone conversation between Trump and Putin. So I have to leave early. However, I promise, I will address the questions that people have put today. I've got it here on the locals, and I'm going to copy and paste, put them into Thursday's discussion, so that I will answer all of the points that people have made today. And so I'm really sorry that I'm cutting it a little short today, but thank you everybody who has what is it? Richard Phillips says Carney is peak garbage. You can't get more neoliberal. He's even worse than the Rutte. Yeah, I agree. Anyway, so sorry for cutting it a bit early. I'll see you again Thursday. Until then, all the best, and thank you for your contributions. See you Thursday. Good night. Bye bye.